Early fighting and independence. And you'll notice here we've gotten into chapter 5, which should be over the American Revolution. So, early fighting on, this is looking at like 1775. This is before any kind of Declaration of Independence kind of thing. We're going to see it continues on in Boston. General Gage is going to be besieged there after Lexington and Concord. He's going to actually decide to seize and fortify this territory south of Boston so his cannons can really command the harbor. He also would go on to spread out, and in June of 1775, General Gage would send soldiers to drive the smaller force of Patriot men and boys from their position in what comes to be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, technically, this is a British success, but it's a big deal because they have over 1,000 casualties, and that's a lot considering they should be the much more dominant position in all of this. However, during the winter of 1775 through 1776, Americans are going to drag some like 60 cannons. It's like 300 miles through the ice and snow over mountains, all the way from Fort Ticonderoga down to Boston. This itself was a harrowing journey, and then they had to mount them overlooking Boston Harbor. This setup was extremely difficult. They did it in the dead of night. They tried to, use camouflage, things like that. There was definitely some luck on the American side being able to do this. And once they finally put the cannons overlooking the harbor, this basically put the British in an indefensible position, and the British would be basically forced to evacuate Boston. The British would then move up north to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and for the time, New England would be secure. We're also going to see early fighting in the South. A lot of the Southern fighting is actually going to be almost like a miniature civil war. There's quite a bit larger loyalist forces in the South. In particular, there's a lot of enslaved people or slaves that had been promised freedom if they fought for the loyalist cause, which would definitely make sense why they would then fight on the British side, of course. But fighting the South generally does go well for the Patriots early on. In 1776 in June, Patriot forces are going to successfully repulse a large British expedition that was sent to attack Charleston in South Carolina. Canada, the Patriot cause is not going to do quite as well. Basically, both of the American armies up there are going to fail pretty miserably. I'm not going to go into all the details about it, but Canada is going to, spoilers, remain a British province. And this brings us back to really independence. The thing is, all these early successes are going to really bolster the Patriots' confidence. But in August of 1775, King George III is going to reject Congress's olive branch petition. And instead, he would actually issue a proclamation that declared the colonies were in full rebellion, and he denied the American colonies his protection. In December of that year, so keep in mind this is like, while this is happening simultaneously, this is going to be starting like, oh, they're pulling the cannons down and everything, and so Boston's under the control of the British, so kind of keep in mind these are all happening simultaneously. But in December of 1775, Parliament would bar all exports from the American colonies. It's one thing when the Americans were deciding to do it. It's another thing when Parliament decides it for them. This is considered a really aggressive action, and it's going to persuade a lot of colonists to abandon their loyalty to the crown, and this is when Americans actually start contemplating independence. However, what's really going to give a push for independence is going to be Thomas Paine. He is going to give the cause of independence a powerful boost by publishing a pamphlet that is called Common Sense in February and January of 1776. Now, this pamphlet, Common Sense, is basically going to denounce King George as well as make a case for independence. Literally, the last words of the pamphlet was, "'Tis time to part." There's going to be over 100,000 copies of this pamphlet dispersed throughout the colonies, and this is really going to help predispose a lot of the American people towards independence. The other thing about independence is there's tactical considerations. The thing is, Patriot leaders look at if they decided to, declare for complete independence and complete separation from Great Britain, they could more easily gain aid from foreign countries like France. And also it could give just these American political leaders a solid legal basis for their newly claimed authority. So accordingly, we are going to see most of the American states would either instruct or permit their delegates in the Continental Congress to vote for independence. Now, this isn't going to happen, though, until June of 1776, when Richard Henry Lee is going to introduce to Congress a resolution stating that the United Colonies, and I quote, are and of right ought to be free and independent states. However, Congress is not going to vote on it quite yet. Instead, they postponed the vote and basically appointed a committee to draw up an official declaration of independence, who, of course, one big part of that committee is going to be Thomas Jefferson, who helps compose the first draft. Although the draft that is later put forward, Jefferson's like, I didn't write this. They made so many changes to my original work. And then, of course, when everybody likes it, he's like, yes, of course, I helped write that. So take that what you will. Basically, after a couple revisions, though, in this committee, they are going to present this document to Congress. Now, they don't vote until there's a clear majority that's going to favor independence. And so Congress will officially vote on July 2nd of 1776, and all voting delegates will approve it. Now, I say all voting delegates because actually the New York delegates are going to abstain from the vote. They just won't vote yes or no either way. However, at that point, there's going to be a little bit further tinkering with the wording, and they will officially adopt the Declaration of Independence on July 4th of 1776. So we declare independence on this day, but America is not, they haven't won independence yet. So keep in mind, now they have to actually win the war. Now, this declaration originally was intended by Congress to be more like a justification for America's secession from the British Empire, because that's really what we were doing. We were seceding the British Empire. And then also they wanted it to be, an invitation to potential allies. But the Declaration of Independence becomes so much more than that. It's really going to present the contract theory of government. And this is extremely important because the contract theory of government is the belief that basically a government is established by human beings to protect certain rights like life, liberty, and property, although we changed that to the pursuit of happiness. And that these rights are natural rights. They are there by divinely sanctioned laws. And so that when a government protects these rights, people are obliged to obey it. The thing is, this contract theory, it's a contract between the people and the government, that this is what the government is supposed to do. And if the government doesn't do that, then you're allowed to oust the government. This theory was actually developed by 17th century English philosopher John Locke, as well as others. And so it's all about this contract, this agreement. A legitimate government is an agreement between the people and the rulers. And the people are bound to obey the rulers as long as the rulers are actually offering them these protections. And so it's a really big deal. When we actually look at the Declaration of Independence itself, you have these four parts to it. The fifth bullet point here is actually the first one, but I want to go back to that at the end. So you have your opening. Hopefully you've heard this before. All men are created equal and have equal rights. The second part of the Declaration of Independence is that people are establishing governments, to protect their fundamental rights. So basically this is that contract theory. This is why we have a government. And then the third part is the rejections of the king. It was a long list of charges that are justifying America's rejections of the king. And then the conclusion, brings these parts together, that Americans, therefore, can rightfully overthrow King George's rule and replace it more satisfactory to them because he has broken that contract theory. So it's combining the different points. I want to jump back to that first point, the opening, because there is an issue here. The thing is, when we say all men are created equally, at this point in time, there was a lot of people in America's society that were excluded from full participation. This would include women, propertyless white men, free black men oftentimes had no formal political rights and they had limited legal rights, and then slaves. Although actually I'm going to go ahead and change over for this. The thing is, I am not going to refer to slaves as slaves anymore. I'm going to refer to them as enslaved. And the reason is this places the responsibility on the oppressors and keeps in mind that, like, a slave, it sounds like, oh, it's just a position of someone and that almost like you could choose that. And that's not the case. Keep in mind, everyone who is enslaved wants to be free on some level. And if they don't want to be free, it's because they've been brainwashed. And so they should want to be free. So the thing is, enslaved people had no rights at all. And so the thing is, when we look at this all men debate, it had very much limited practical meaning back in 1776. Hopefully, since then, America has, confronted this moral challenge and made good on it. Whether it has completely or not, that is up to you to decide. I do want to mention, though, the reaction to all of the Declaration. The thing is, some people rejoiced as like orators would read the Declaration of Independence out loud. Others were really concerned, though, because there is this question once again, how is America then going to govern themselves? The thing is, most Whigs really wanted some sort of Republican government. Republicanism is very much a complex, changing body of ideas, values, assumptions, but generally it is either self-government directly through like the citizens. So this is like when you go and vote on like, oh yes, we'll put this law into place in our county or in our country or in our state, or indirect self-government by elected representatives. Okay, I'm not going to vote for all the laws, but I'm going to vote in place my senator. I'm going to vote in place my representative, etc., etc. They felt like Republicanism provided a much more reliable foundation for like a good society and ensuring like individual freedoms rather than, rule by a monarchy. Once again, this goes into things like contract theory that, oh, the government is there by the consent of the governed. The governed are the people who decided what the government was going to do. And then, of course, it also ties into country ideology. Remember that way back, which is that whole suspicion of an excessive centralized government and this insistent need for some sort of virtuous citizenry to be our representatives, but also that the citizens as a whole should be voting to better the country idea. So I want you to think, as part of your journal, what kind of problems could you run into with this type of government? Yes, we have generally this kind of government. When I say a Republican government, I'm not meaning Republican Democrat. I'm just meaning Republican as in Republicanism. But we have a government like this today. So what kind of problems are potentially going to be in place if you have this kind of government?